Welcome to the first day of Chapter 8. Today is day 1. It's a review of midpoint, distance, and slope. These are 3 concepts that we covered first semester that we're going to use again in this chapter. We're just going to do a quick review of each one of those, and then you guys are going to do some problems on your own. First one, here's the midpoint formula. Remember that the midpoint is the point that cuts a segment in half, so it creates 2 congruent segments. This is the midpoint formula. When you add your x's, divide by 2. Add your y's, divide by 2. So here's our first example. It says find the midpoint of 1, -8 and -4, 2. So midpoint is equal to, add your x's. Remember that x is the first point in the coordinate. So I'm going to do 1 add -4 divided by 2. And then the y's are -8 and 2 divided by 2. So 1 add -4 is -3 over 2. -8 add 2 is -6 divided by 2. So our midpoint ends up being -3 halves, comma, -3. Okay, so that's one type of example you're going to see. Here's a different example. It says, given an endpoint of 3, -4, and a midpoint of -5, 6, find the other endpoint. Okay, so I'm going to draw us a little picture first of what we're looking at. It says we have an endpoint of 3, -4, and a midpoint of -5, 6. In the last example, we were given the 2 endpoints, and you had to find the midpoint. This example, we're given one endpoint, the midpoint, we have to find the other endpoint. So this endpoint is x, y. That's what we're looking for. I'm going to start by writing the midpoint formula. This is always a good way to start, just to give yourself a little direction. And now I'm going to fill in what we know. We know the midpoint, so that's -5, 6. And we know one endpoint, that's this one. So I have 3 add. My other endpoint has a coordinate of x over 2, and then y and y. Okay, I have 2 variables, x and y, so I'm going to need 2 equations. Here is where one equation comes from. It comes from the x's. So I end up with -5 equals 3 add x over 2. And then here's where my second equation comes from the y's. So I get 6 equals -4 add y all over 2. Starting with this x equation, put your -5 over 1. Now do cross products. -5 multiplied by 2 is -10. I get -10 is equal to 3 add x. If I subtract 3, I get x is equal to -13. Okay, for the y's, put 6 over 1. 6 multiplied by 2 is 12. I get 12 is equal to -4 add y. If I add 4 to both sides, I get 16 is equal to y. So then our other endpoint is -13, 16. Okay, so this is a little bit longer. This is when you're given one endpoint and the midpoint. So that was a review of midpoint. Now we're going to go on to distance formula. Here's the distance formula. This is the one that's a little nastier. It has the square root. So you could write that down. The example says find the distance between 1, -8 and -4, 2. So same 2 points, but now we're finding the distance. Okay, so distance is equal to square root. It says x2 subtract x1. Here's my x2, here's my x1. Doesn't matter which ones you pick to be x2 and x1. So I get 1 subtract -4 squared, add. Okay, so if this is x1, if this is x2, this has to be y2. So -8 subtract 2 squared. Okay, so 1 subtract -4 is 5 squared. -8 subtract 2 is -10 squared. So this ends up being the square root of 25 add 100. Continuing up here, 25 add 100 is 125. Now I need to see, can I simplify this? Yes. What perfect square goes into 125? Hopefully you know that that's 25 multiplied by 5. Now the square root of 25 is 5. And then keep that root 5 because we can't simplify it anymore. So the distance between these 2 points is 5 root 5. Okay, we have one more formula to review, and that's slope. Remember, slope is rise over run. It's a measurement of the steepness between 2 points. So the slope formula is y2 subtract y1 over x2 subtract x1. What's really important is this y2 x2 and this y1 x1. These are each points. So you have to make sure that these two numbers come from the same point and these two numbers come from the same point. So let's do our example. Again, same 2 points, but now we're finding the slope. Okay, this time I'm going to call this one y2 and this one y1. Doesn't matter which point you choose to be point 2 and which one you choose to be point 1. Okay, so I have 2 subtract negative 8. Now the denominator is very important. It's very important that I put negative 4 first. And that's because 2 came first in the numerator. So I have negative 4 subtract 1. 2 subtract negative 8 is 10. Negative 4 subtract 1 is negative 5. When I simplify this, my slope ends up being negative 2, or negative 2 over 1. Okay, so this was a quick review. Hopefully that jogged your memory a little bit. Here's some Sochi trivia for you. Athletes from which state in the US have won the most gold medals? It's not Illinois, I will tell you that. But see if you can jot down an idea. We'll talk about it in class. Okay, here's the example for you to try. I'm giving you the points negative 2, 7 and negative 10, negative 3. I would like you to find the midpoint, the distance, and the slope. Pause the video, do all 3 of these bullet points, come back when you're finished, please. Okay, first one, midpoint. I'm going to start by writing the formula. If you start with the wrong formula, you're going to get the wrong answer. Okay, so midpoint is add your x's divided by 2, add your y's divided by 2. So my x's are negative 10 and negative 2. My y's are 7 and negative 3. Negative 2 add negative 10 is negative 12. 7 add negative 3 is 4. So my midpoint ends up being negative 6, 2. So hopefully you got that one right. Moving on, finding the distance. Again, I'm going to start by writing the distance formula. This is just a good habit to get in the practice of. Okay, y2 subtract, or x2 subtract x1. I'm going to call this one x2, this one x1. If you did it the other way, that's fine. You should still get the same answer. So negative 2 subtract negative 10 squared. Now I need to subtract my y's. 7 subtract negative 3 squared. Okay, 2 subtract negative 10 ends up being 8 squared. And then 7 subtract negative 3 is 10 squared. So this is the square root of 64, add 100. So this ends up being the square root of 164. So now I need to determine what perfect square goes into 164. I think we've talked about this in class, but 164 is even. If it's even, always try 4. It's always a good place to start. In this case, 4 does go into 164. It goes in 41 times. The square root of 4 is 2. Root 41 you cannot simplify anymore, so leave it like that. Okay, so we're almost finished. Let's just go through slope really quickly. Okay, find the slope between the 2 points. M is the symbol for slope. It's y2 minus y1 over x2 subtract x1. I'm going to write slope so we don't get it confused with midpoint. Okay, so I'm going to do negative 3 subtract 7 over negative 10 subtract negative 2. Negative 3 subtract 7 is negative 10 over negative 8. And that simplifies to 5 over 4. Okay, so hopefully those 3 went well for you, and if not, you just made simple little mistakes. Here's what we did today. We reviewed midpoint, distance, and slope. And remember, you're going to need to know these throughout this chapter. Thank you.